Alright, let's go ahead and go over how to get cruise control to work on the ALH. The ALH is significantly easier to get it done than PDs and common rails because there is no need for you to go in and tell it that what your gear ratio is, what your tire size is, etc., etc. So in my opinion, I think that the ALH is easier. So on pin 14, we're going to need it feed at 12 volt ignition when you first power on the ECU. You're going to need a vehicle speed sensor. This can be accomplished a bunch of different ways. I've tried it with a crank position sensor from the old 4-liter on the bell housing. I have used a digital sensor on my Dana 300 to output a signal. I've used my GPS pedometer to output a signal, and I've created a device that takes the tachometer output, which is pin 27, to a VSS converter, so it allows for you to constantly have a vehicle speed. This works perfectly fine in manuals, but in automatics it is problematic. The engine has a tendency to want to die as a result of coming to a stop. So again, a bunch of different ways to do it, but the ECU needs to see a vehicle speed so it knows what to target. Where it comes from, it doesn't matter as long as the signal is set correctly. And then we go to cruise control buttons, 44, 45, 46. 46 is power on to the ECU, telling it to be ready for the set button, and so on and so forth. Again, common sense. Then we have a brake switch, which is a little confusing, and then we have a clutch switch. So the clutch switch, if you want to wire up an actual clutch switch, you need to have 12 volts going to pin 66 when it's in its neutral resting state. And when you push the clutch in, 12 volts needs to be pulled away. So we need a clutch switch, vehicle speed sensor switch, all the wiring associated with the cruise control, which is momentary 12 volts, and 12 volt ignition. Then we go to the brake switch. So the brake switch is a dual position switch. You can kind of see that this one is open, and this one over here is normally closed, which means that pin 2, which comes from the 109 circuit, comes to 12, 12 goes across, and that's 12 volt ignition, the same way you would feed the 12 volt ignition to pins 1 and 2 on the ECU. So it has 12 volts of ignition as soon as the key on is set. So it comes down, goes across, comes up pin 3, goes across to 1, comes away from 1, goes to pin 65. So that is one of the brake switch inputs for the ECU, pin 65, that should see 12 volts when ignition is turned on. Then we have the other one, which is 12 volt ignition as well. It's normally, in its resting state, it's normally open. When you trigger it, it's going to pull this and close here, come across, go to 13, come across from 13, and go into pin 32. So 32 is the second input for the ECU, for the brake switch. What is supposed to happen is when you trigger this switch, and this one comes over and closes, this one opens at the same time. They need to be exactly at the same time. You can see that in VCDS to make sure that it's operating properly. The problem is that there is floating voltage on pin 3. So even though this is closing and this is opening, there's still voltage here. So what the ECU sees is both of these hitting both of these hitting voltage at the same time, which is a problem. So there are a couple different ways to remedy this. One of these is with 2 automotive relays, 5-pin relays. You can figure out how to wire those yourself. It's relatively easy. An additional way is this schematic here, which is a transistor, a series of resistors. You wire it all up, and you're good to go. The easiest way, which costs the most money, is a circuit that my brother has designed and built. And it's basically the same thing as the schematic I just showed you. And it's super simple. You just wire it up, and it works perfectly fine. In any case, whatever method you decide to do this, you need to have a working brake switch. You need to have 12 volts to the clutch wire, and all of these up here. So it's relatively simple. You need to make sure all these work in VCDS Go into block 6 and measuring blocks, and you can see all these buttons work. You can see the brake switch work. If you have a clutch switch, you can see the clutch switch work. So that's how you test everything. And then, of course, you would have to have speed. Without speed, you're not going to be able to get it to work. So I talked briefly earlier, the PDs and later need the tuner to go in and actually make adjustments to the tune based on tire size and ratio and everything like that. So if you were ever to change it, and it goes outside the window, I'm sure there's a safety margin. If you go from a 30-inch tire to a 47-inch tire, for example, I'm pretty sure it won't work. But if you go from a 30 to a 31, it might still function properly. Just make sure that your tuner knows exactly what he or she is doing before you do that. But yeah, ALH, super, super simple.
Gotta feel it, you don't mean it, while you're sad right now. I gotta feel it, there's something about you.